Hi, everyone. This is Amy from Amy's Kitchen, and I am really excited to be here with Alexis Timken, who is a scientist and toxicologist with the Environmental Working Group. And we are just going to have a little chat and a conversation today. So thank you for being here, Alexis.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. My first question for you is sort of about the connection between what we do at Amy's and what you guys do. We started over 30 years ago, and we've been committed to sourcing organic ingredients for our meals. And we at Amy's believe that choosing organic is better for people and better for the environment. For those of us who are watching who aren't super familiar with the Environmental Working Group, can you tell us about the work you do and the work that the Environmental Working Group does?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Environmental Working Group, or EWG as we go by, is really a research and advocacy based organization with our mission to empower people to live healthier lives in a healthier environment. And so what that often looks like is taking sort of complex research about environmental health, particularly exposures to synthetic chemicals, some of which are pesticides, and distilling that down into information consumers can grab onto and use in their daily lives.
Well, that's a lot of work. And
Yeah,
what do you do specifically in that area? What is a
yeah.
toxicologist?
So as a toxicologist, I have my hands in a few different places, but really the main goal or the main work that I do is evaluating the safety of chemicals that we're exposed to every day. So that can be pesticides in food. It might be chemicals that are used in consumer and personal care products, chemicals that you might find in your drinking water. So they show up in a lot of different places, and a lot of chemicals have been associated with adverse health impacts. So we look at the research on that and then help communicate that to consumers, and then also give advice and tips on how to avoid some of those exposures.
That's amazing. So the Dirty Dozen has become a really popular consumer guide that I think many people are familiar with, and it's released each year. Can you explain a little bit about what the Dirty Dozen is and how it may impact people watching?
Sure. So the Dirty Dozen is part of a larger report we do every year called the Shopper's Guide to Pesticide in Produce. And what that is an analysis of pesticides that are found on 46 different fruits and vegetables. And this is data that's actually collected by the US Department of Agriculture, the USDA. They test fruits and vegetables every year for pesticide residue. And we take that information and look at the data and then rank the fruits and vegetables that have the most pesticide residues, aptly named the Dirty Dozen. So the top 12 of those. And then we also have the Clean 15, which are the 15 fruits and vegetables that are going to have the fewest pesticide residues.
Would you mind sharing? Do you know off the top of your head what the Dirty Dozen are?
At least in terms of the Dirty Dozen, the most contaminated fruits and vegetables are going to be items like strawberries, spinach, other greens like kale, collards, and mustard greens. You'll see some stone fruits on there like nectarines, apples, peaches, and then some bell and hot peppers, celery, and tomatoes, I think are almost all of them.
And so does this help people grocery shopping if they can't be totally organic, sort of figure out how to prioritize which produce is the most important for them to choose organic?
Yeah, exactly. So, we know that consumers are increasingly seeking out clean foods. And so some of that might be choosing organic fruits and vegetables all the time. But there's a lot of instances where, organic fruits and vegetables might not be readily available, or they might be cost prohibitive. And so the shopper's guide is this kind of unique way to encourage people to get more fruits and vegetables in their diet, and then help them do that without compromising on pesticide exposure. So, if you're a shopper and you're concerned about pesticide exposure and want to reduce your pesticide exposure, then you might choose the dirty dozen that are as organic, right? And then if you want to look at something that you could buy conventionally, you might look at the clean 15 and know that you can still get the benefits of those fruits and vegetables with low pesticide exposure.
That's amazing. When did you start releasing the shopper's guide, and what was the real motivation there?
Yeah, so EWG started this in 2004. So
Wow.
I've been at EWG for about 3.5 years working
Mhm.
on this, but it's been around for a really long time. And it really, I think, was started to address a few things. So one being to give consumers really a tool and a way to reduce their pesticide exposure. Of course, we recommend also choosing organic to fulfill that
Yeah.
sort of need, since synthetic pesticides aren't used in organic produce. But also there was, I think at the time, and really almost a decade earlier, around in the 90s, there was this conversation was really started based on some evidence that was coming out about the harmful effects of pesticides in the diet, particularly for children's health. So this
Yeah,
was a
tell me
way,
more about that.
yeah.
I'm a mother of a young child myself, and I, as most mothers do, constantly worry about the impact of environmental toxins on my child's health and development. And I know many of our consumers are mothers or fathers as well, and really think about their kids. Can you share a little bit more about those impacts?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd say like the early 90s, right, there was this really groundbreaking report by the National Academy of Sciences that looked at the pesticides in the diet of children and infants. And some of their main conclusions were really saying, we need to look at children differently than adults. Children have higher exposures just based on the fact that they're smaller and eat more, sort of that ratio gives them a higher exposure. They have different abilities to metabolize pesticides and other chemicals compared to adults. And also, they're in this really unique developmental stage, right? Where the biology that's happening either during pregnancy or during childhood can set you up for, your health trajectories later in life. And if you induce or introduce types of exposures, you can shift that, right? And cause some sort of adverse health outcomes later in life. So with pesticides specifically, I think some of the strongest evidence is really for adverse neurodevelopmental outcomes. So this might
Mhm.
look like reduced IQ or behavioral issues in terms of autism or sort of symptoms of ADHD
Right.
and other types of neurodevelopment. There's really strong evidence for that. And then other health concerns can be increased risk of cancer. And then importantly, during sort of pregnancy too, we see, and even before pregnancy, there's associations with pesticides and reduced fertility and things like low birth weight and other birth outcomes. So it's kind of all of these critical and sensitive windows of development are important
Yeah.
times to think about pesticide exposure.
More things for moms to be freaked out about, right? But I mean, thankfully, we do have resources like the shopper's guide and the ability to potentially buy cleaner and organic produce during those sensitive windows, so that we can hopefully protect ourselves during pregnancy and our children. So
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely.
And when my parents started Amy's, there was no organic standard. There was no, and there wasn't a lot of science, but this was back in the 80s.
Yeah.
Um, and part of their motivation to start organic was in talking to farmers when they were doing the research about getting started. They heard a lot of stories, and these were just anecdotal at the time, as there weren't really studies about the impact on farmers and their families and farm workers, the people who actually work daily and touch the food and apply the pesticides and herbicides. And they were just hearing some pretty intense, like almost horror stories about health impacts. And now that there's been more time and more research, is there any validity or studies or science to back up what we were hearing 30 years ago from farmers and their families?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I can only imagine sort of, I guess, how right, interesting and upsetting and troubling some of those stories were. But like you said, this was 30 to 40 years ago. And
Mhm.
now we have evidence from that 30 to 40-year time period, particularly looking at studies in humans, right? So
Right.
epidemiological evidence where you can actually look at farm workers and their families. There's been a lot of studies done there where we've seen some of these health effects that I mentioned earlier, right? Like
Mhm.
children's exposure to these organophosphate pesticides and adverse neurological outcomes. A lot of that work came out of farm worker sort of cohorts and families and people that lived really close to residential applications of
Yeah.
pesticides, particularly in California. So we've seen, you know, those data to actually support a lot of those claims. And then we've also seen, at least within the EPA and sort of the way we regulate pesticides, also ecological health harms too, and sort of starting to focus a little bit more on that aspect of pesticides, which still, is not, there's loopholes in both of those places, I think, that need to be considered a bit more.
Right. Yeah. I was going to ask about that as well. I know that your focus is on toxicology and the human impacts, but we really also focus on the ecosystems and the impact on bugs, birds, waterways, the health of the soil. And do you have any thoughts on the current research on how organic versus non-organic impacts the ecosystem?
Yeah, so I think and this is something that comes with, I guess, in the shopper's guide, right? You can buy
Mhm.
conventional versions of the Clean 15 that have low pesticide residue, but that's not necessarily the only thing that comes with organic, right? So
Right.
I think this is part of some of the work we do and some of the goals we want to see in the organic space is, telling consumers really what the differences are between organic and conventional across a variety of sort of um, health aspects and why the organic field really is so great. So that includes, like you said, ecological considerations. I mean, at the EPA, there's really hardly any consideration for soil health specifically in
Right.
pesticide toxicity. So that's one aspect of it. And then in terms of, there's also food additives and sort of colorants, preservatives, and other synthetic chemicals that can't be added to organic food. So that's another sort of layer to go along with the reduced pesticide exposure.
And you've been talking about the EPA and organics, and a lot of these have policies and things like that. Are there anything at the sort of larger food policy level in the country that our consumers should be paying attention to right now?
Yeah, so I think when I think about pesticide policy and food policy in general, I usually think about the EPA and then the FDA.
Yeah.
And they have really two big sort of basically policies that govern how they regulate. And both of those have loopholes within them that we're sort of always looking to close those loopholes. There are really specific pesticides that deserve regulatory action kind of immediately. And those are really the organophosphate insecticides and chlorpyrifos. So some of your consumers might be familiar with kind of this story of chlorpyrifos, which is really wild, where it's been approved for use for a long time. In 2016, the EPA's own scientists really, evaluated the evidence and concluded it was unsafe. And
Mhm.
then for sort of bureaucratic reasons, we've seen the administration overturn a potential ban and still allow it on the market. And so that's something that I think is really worth following and probably something that we'll see action on, at least hopefully in the next couple of years or so, if not next year.
Thank you. Yeah, it definitely seems like from a policy perspective, there's more of a approve things and then see if they do harm later than really a long period to really test that before these pesticides and herbicides and other things are approved. Would you say that that's kind of true?
Yeah, I think so. And what we've seen, at least with EPA and pesticide regulation too, is that often, right, things are sort of considered safe up until the point that they're not, and then they're banned, or there might be
That seems so
market.
opposite to me. Like, I feel like things should
Yeah.
be considered unsafe until they're proved safe, and then they're allowed to be used, instead of like everything's assumed to be safe until we see a huge health impact, and then we retroactively take it off the market.
Yeah, and this is evident too in the food additive and FDA space. So
Mhm.
there's uh, basically a policy called GRAS, that some people might hear of, is generally recognized as safe, where a lot of food additives have been on the market, for decades, and there's been evidence and new scientific evidence that could suggest potential health harms, but there's no policy in place to go back and reevaluate, or there's no requirement for FDA to go back and look at those data. So what we see is sort of pesticides and food additives that have been on the market for a really long time based on really old data. And
Yeah.
the reevaluation process is really what lags behind.
Yeah. And man, I mean, I already obviously eat mostly organic and I'm in the organic food space, but this conversation is making me feel even more
Yeah.
motivated to be more careful and more conscious about what I'm choosing.
Yeah,
Um,
well, and I think it's something too, like consumers are seeking that out. And so
mhm.
we have seen, at least, in 2022, there was even an increase in organic food consumption. So it's a space that's right growing and changing, and hopefully something that consumers can really trust, what's behind the organic label, and make that choice.
Yeah, I mean, one of the questions that we get a lot is there's some confusion between the non-GMO seal and the organic seal. And we feel like there's a really big difference there, which is why we focused on organic. And do you want to speak a little bit to the difference there?
Yeah, so I guess the best way to describe the difference there is that the GMO seal is encompassed within the organic seal,
Mhm.
and the organic seal also covers many more things. So, right, with organic, you're going to get restrictions on pesticide use, and you're
Yeah,
going to get restrictions on what can be added to food. So when we think about there's no synthetic preservatives, colorants. Um, and that's not something you see with conventional food or with non-GMO food, right? So you can still use pesticides, you can still use certain food additives.
yeah,
The only thing that's mentioned there is that there's non-GMO, which impacts a few foods, primarily packaged foods that use a lot of like corn or soy-based
right.
products. Um, but other ingredients, there's still, potential pesticide use or food additives that, can have considerable or concerning health outcomes.
How can consumers hold companies that use pesticides accountable?
Yeah, this is a great question. So I think part of what we do, at least in our research too, is we of course want to shift policy and we want to give consumers choices in education, but we also like to shift the marketplace and put pressure on companies, since that's a lot of times where we see sort of the first action at least taken against chemicals, and then sometimes the policy tends to follow along when something's already happened.
Yes.
Um, so I think we definitely urge consumers to voice what's important to them in terms of talking to companies. And we can give an example of this where a few years ago, we started testing oat-based products for glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in the herbicide Roundup.
Mhm.
And we did this because most people, when you think about glyphosate, you think about corn and soy, which is where it's used mostly, but it's also used on some crops like oats and cereal grains at the end of the season to actually kill down the crop. It's called pre-harvest desiccation. And so
Mhm.
it can get in things like oats and wheat. And so we tested these products, and these are products, that people and children are primarily eating, like cereals and snack bars. And so what came with that was then, consumers could sign a petition that we delivered to major companies. And we've seen companies then say, okay, we're going to phase out the use of glyphosate in this way. So
That's
that's sort of,
amazing.
yeah, it's one of those
It's
wins, which is
empowering. It
really
shows that we
exciting.
really
Yeah.
can, just as the average person, feeding our kids, we can actually put enough pressure on the companies that we buy from that they listen and change what they do.
Yeah, absolutely. And so similarly, right, like buying organic is one way to do that.
Mhm.
So as that industry continues to grow, it signifies that that's something people are interested in.
And in terms of organic, what are you most excited about right now in the food industry as a whole?
I think I think, when I think about when I walk into a grocery store now and the variety of organic foods that I see compared to like when I was grocery shopping with my mom when I was little, it's just
Totally.
that growth and expansion, right? There's just so much more variety, and that's what's really exciting. And that also means that there's going to be more accessibility for people. So you can see it. I think you can find like organic snack bars in common sort of convenience stores, or which maybe was not the case, however many years ago.
It totally wasn't. I mean, I had the same experience. My parents only fed me organic food, and I was always crying for the organic equivalent of the candy bars or the this or the prepackaged sucky snacks that kids got to have. And now all of that is available in organic as well. And as a mom, I'm able to access so much more and not just go to the little teeny tiny corner health food store. I can go to even Walmart and get a ton of organic food, right? It's just the exposure of it is it's been pretty incredible, and it's very inspiring.
For sure.
And last but not least, although we may ask a few more questions, but we have to ask, do you have a favorite Amy's food?
I do have a favorite Amy's food. I'm like a big soup fan.
Me
So
too.
for me, like in the winters and when it's just kind of cold and you want to sort of not do a ton, and that might also mean cooking, I think there's just an awesome, quick, easy, healthy thing to go to. So I love the soup personally.
Do you have a particular soup?
I really like the lentil-based ones.
Me too. The lentil soup is actually my mom made that soup for me, like, from scratch every week growing up. It was like our family lentil soup. So that was like my primary soup. The lentil and then the lentil veg were sort of her two different versions of it. And so when we started coming out with soups, it was one of the first ones we came out with. And so it's still my favorite because it's what I grew up eating all the time.
That's so sweet.
Yeah. Although my mom then cooks it for me, and I'm like, oh, this is delicious. But she's like, you're not as excited. I'm like, well, I can just you canned it for me. So thank you so much, Alexis. This was such a fun and informative conversation. And I will be sure to tell my parents that they were right and spot on in their intuition and in listening to people, back in the 80s about why they should start an organic business, an organic food business. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It was really fun.